Biomed, Nexus Daily Updates, your essential biotech, medtech, and pharma recap. No noise, just what matters. TLDR FDA reviewers questioned whether Capricor's resubmitted Duramyocel filing shows substantial evidence of effectiveness in Duchenne muscular dystrophy cardiomyopathy days before this week's advisory committee meeting. Replimune's rejected melanoma drug also faces an adcomm this week. GSK launched a 3-year restructuring targeting $2.5b in annual cost savings by 2029 alongside a 400-meter flagship R&D center in Cambridge to fund its pipeline push. Apnime set terms for an IPO of up to 150 meters to bring its obstructive sleep apnea pill toward the market. Section 232 pharma tariffs hit large companies Friday, the week's thread, and now 2 days out. Sarepta named Michael Severino its new CEO, a leadership reset for the embattled Duchenne gene therapy company. Executive takeaway: the FDA's relationship with its own advisory committees is getting strange, and Capricor is caught in the middle of it. Ahead of this week's advisory meeting on Duramyocel, its cell therapy for the cardiac complications of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, FDA reviewers released documents questioning whether the resubmitted filing actually shows substantial evidence of effectiveness in male patients. That is a discouraging signal to walk into a hearing with, and it lands inside a bigger puzzle we started tracking in June, when the FDA surprised everyone by calling an adcomm for Duramyocel et al., a drug it had already rejected once. This week, the agency holds adcoms for both Capricor and Replimune, 2 previously rejected therapies, and as Biospace put it, industry is asking what the FDA is actually trying to accomplish. Some leaders were surprised the meetings were called. The rationale is murky. Here is the read we have carried since the spring. The FDA under acting leadership has been more flexible in some places, accepting resubmissions and reversing prior demands, and more procedurally cautious in others, adding adcoms that were not expected. It is not a single coherent posture. It is an agency without permanent leadership improvising case by case, and that unpredictability is itself the problem for companies trying to plan. For Capricor specifically, the reviewer doubts raise real risk into an already uncertain hearing, and the August 22nd decision date now looks more precarious than it did. If you hold Capricor, this week is binary and the setup just got worse. The other story worth your time is GSK, which announced a 3-year restructuring aimed at $2.5b in annual savings by 2029, paired with a new 400M R&D center in Cambridge. This is the same disciplined capital reallocation we have watched from Luke Mills all year, cutting costs to fund the pipeline after the Nuvalent deal and the Camlipixant and Alecta failures, and keep one eye on Friday when the Section 232 tariffs take effect. That remains the week's through line, and it is now 2 days away. Read full analysis. Regulatory. The FDA cast doubt on Capricor right before the hearing that decides its fate. Ahead of this week's advisory committee meeting, FDA reviewers questioned whether Capricor's resubmitted Duramyocel filing provides substantial evidence of effectiveness in cardiomyopathy in male Duchenne muscular dystrophy patients, according to the pharma letter. Briefing documents that cast doubt on efficacy are a hard way to enter an adcomm, since the panel weighs exactly that question. The meeting is part of a curious cluster. The FDA is also holding an adcomm this week for Replimune's melanoma drug, another therapy it previously rejected. Biospace reported that some industry leaders were surprised the meetings were called at all and have questioned the rationale, asking what the agency's renewed embrace of adcoms is meant to achieve. We flagged the surprise Capricor adcomm back in June as evidence that the FDA's reset is uneven. This week, tests that read in real time, and Capricor's August 22nd decision date now carries more risk. Corporate GSK is cutting $2.5b to feed its pipeline. GSK announced a 3-year restructuring targeting $2 5B in annual cost savings by 2029, alongside plans for a 400-metre flagship R&D centre at the Cambridge Biomedical Campus, according to industry reporting. The move is meant to free up capital to fund pipeline growth, and it fits the pattern we have tracked from CEO Luke Mills all year. GSK has cut losing programs fast, walking away from camlipixant in chronic cough and its Electa Neuropact while spending big where it sees winners, most notably the $10. 6B Nuvalent acquisition that just delivered GSK's first lung cancer approval. Restructuring to lower the cost base and concentrate investment in R&D is the logical next step. It is disciplined and coherent, and it puts still more weight on the retained pipeline to deliver the growth the cost cuts are meant to fund. IPO Apnimed is taking its sleep apnea pill public. Apnimed set terms for an IPO of up to $150 million to advance Oxnimbi, its oral therapy for obstructive sleep apnea, toward a potential commercial launch, according to the pharma letter. Obstructive sleep apnea is a large, underserved condition, mostly managed today, with CPAP machines that many patients cannot tolerate, so an effective pill would address real unmet need. The space has drawn fresh attention as GLP-1 drugs showed benefit in sleep apnea tied to obesity, and a dedicated oral option is a different and potentially complementary approach. The IPO adds to a 2026 class already tracking toward the most biotech debuts since 2021. Quick hits Sarepta, named Michael Severino as CEO, effective this week, a leadership reset for the Duchenne gene therapy company after a bruising stretch of safety and commercial setbacks. Sun Pharma launched generic semaglutide in South Africa for type 2 diabetes, an early example of the generic GLP-1 wave that will reshape the category as patents lapse in various markets. The FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence issued 3 final guidances to broaden clinical trial eligibility, a quietly meaningful step toward enrolling more representative patient populations in cancer studies. Atea Pharmaceuticals said its hepatitis C regimen matched Gilead's Epclusa in a Phase 3 trial, a potential new entrant in a market Gilead has long dominated. Coming up, this week, FDA adcoms for Capricor Duramycel and Replimune RP1. This week, Roche and other big pharma Q2 earnings. Friday, July 31st. Section 232 pharma tariffs effective for large companies. Late July, BMS KarXT Alzheimer's psychosis readout. PTC Cypiopterin PKU readout. August 22, Capricor Duramycel PDUFA read. Full analysis Biomed Nexus. Pro-institutional intelligence. Brief. What the FDA's adcomm revival actually means. The FDA holding advisory committee meetings this week for 2 previously rejected therapies, Capricor's Duramycel and Replimune's RP1, is confusing the industry, and the confusion itself is the story worth understanding. Advisory committees are panels of outside experts who review a drug's evidence and vote on a recommendation which the FDA can follow or ignore. They were once routine for novel or contested applications, but their use had declined in recent years. The agency now calling them for 2 drugs it already rejected, and that some expected to move forward through resubmission, has left industry leaders puzzled about the rationale, according to Biospace. Here is the interpretive challenge. On one hand, the FDA under acting leadership has been notably flexible, reversing its demand for more Unicori Huntington's data, accepting Replimune's resubmission after 2 rejections, and approving formulations and expansions that ease access. That looked like a friendlier agency. On the other hand, adding unexpected adcoms for already rejected rare disease therapies introduces a procedural hurdle and signals caution. Those 2 impulses do not obviously fit together. Our read is that they reflect an agency without settled leadership improvising. Different review divisions, different acting officials, and different drugs are getting handled according to different instincts without a unifying philosophy imposed from the top. The result is unpredictability, which is arguably worse for the industry than a consistently strict or consistently lenient posture because you cannot plan around it. For the two companies this week, the stakes are concrete. The reviewer doubts on Capricor's efficacy evidence make its adcomm genuinely risky, and a negative panel vote would cast a long shadow over the August 22nd decision. Replimune's situation is different, since its drug already cleared resubmission acceptance, but an adcomm still injects uncertainty. For investors, both are now binary events this week, rather than the smoother paths a friendlier FDA had seemed to promise. And for the broader industry, the lesson is that the FDA reset we have described is real, but genuinely uneven, and until permanent leadership arrives with a clear philosophy that unevenness is the operating environment. Build adcomm risk into every rare disease timeline because the agency has shown it will call one even when you do not expect it. GSK's restructuring. Discipline or pressure GSK cutting toward $2, 5B in annual savings by 2029, while building a new R&D center reads as strategy, but it is worth asking whether it is strength or strain. The case for strength. Reallocating capital from overhead to R&D is exactly what a well-run company does when it has conviction in its pipeline. GSK under Luke Meals has shown a clear philosophy this year. Cut programs whose data disappoint quickly and spend aggressively on assets it believes in, like the $10. 6B Nuvalent deal that just produced its first lung cancer approval. A restructuring that lowers the cost base and funds the pipeline is consistent with that discipline, and the new Cambridge Center signals GSK is investing in its scientific future, not just trimming. The case for pressure. Companies also cut costs when growth is hard to find and the pipeline needs to carry more than it comfortably can. GSK abandoned two late-stage programs in the past month, camlipixant and the Electa drugs, which thinned the near-term pipeline and concentrated risk on fewer assets. A $2 5B cost program can be read as freeing up money to compensate for a pipeline that needs more shots on goal and as a hedge against its own patent pressures. Our read leans toward disciplined reallocation rather than distress, but with a real caveat. The strategy only works if the retained pipeline delivers. GSK is betting that a leaner cost structure plus concentrated R&D investment plus a few high-conviction assets like the Nuvalent drugs beats a broader but less focused approach. That is a defensible bet, and the zidesamtinib approval is early evidence it can pay off. But every cut raises the stakes on what remains, and the margin for pipeline disappointment keeps shrinking. Watch neladalkib and the rest of the oncology push, because they now have to justify not just the Nuvalent price, but the whole restructuring thesis. Sleep apnea's Moment Apnimed's IPO for an oral obstructive sleep apnea drug arrives as the condition draws real commercial interest for the first time in years, and the competitive setup is worth mapping. Obstructive sleep apnea affects a large population and is dangerously underdiagnosed and undertreated. The standard therapy, CPAP, works when used, but has notoriously poor adherence because many patients cannot tolerate sleeping with a machine and mask. That leaves a large gap for a pharmacological option, which is what Apnimed is pursuing with an oral drug. The GLP-1 dimension changed the conversation. Tirzepatide showed meaningful benefit in obesity-related sleep apnea and won an indication which validated the idea that a pill can treat the condition and drew attention to the market. But GLP-1s address the obesity that drives many apnea cases, not the airway mechanics directly, which leaves room for a dedicated therapy that works through a different mechanism and could help patients whose apnea is not primarily weight-driven or complement GLP-1 treatment in those whose is. For Apnimed, the opportunity is a large underserved market with a clear unmet need and a therapeutic approach distinct from both CPAP and the GLP-1s. The risk is that the GLP-1 wave, which is expanding into every corner of metabolic and related disease, absorbs enough of the apnea population to limit the standalone opportunity. The IPO will fund the push toward commercialization, and the key questions are the strength of the efficacy data and how clearly the drug differentiates from simply treating obesity. In a year hungry for IPOs, a differentiated sleep apnea pill is a story investors will engage with, and the reception will say something about appetite for specialty respiratory and metabolic assets. Coming catalysts: Capricor and Replimune adcoms this week, Roche earnings this week. Section 232 tariffs hit Friday. Late July brings the CAR-XT and CP-Upterin readouts. The full catalyst calendar returns Friday. The FDA cast doubt on Capricor days before its hearing, and the agency's adcomm revival has everyone guessing. GSK is cutting 2.5B to fund its pipeline, and the tariffs land Friday. What are you watching? Reply to this email. Visit the Pro Hub Read. Full article sponsorship slots for 2026 are limited. See packages and pricing. New Biomed Nexus signals, weekly sales intelligence for life sciences BD teams. Learn more.